Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Welcome to the latest in our In Conversation series. My name is Philip Cowley from the School of Politics and International Relations, and I'm delighted to have with me today the Shadow Home Secretary. For those who've been to these events before or haven't, the format is exactly the same as normal. Diane and I will chat for half an hour or so, then we'll throw the event open to you. You can ask questions and we'll try and get a discussion going. My interviewing style is more Jimmy Young than Jeremy Paxman, and so you may find yourself sitting there furious that I'm not asking some brutal killer question. Well, you can have a go later. Diane was first elected to Parliament in 1987, MP for Hackney and Stoke Newington, at the age of just 33, when she became the first black woman MP in British history. And in fact, on the first book I ever wrote, which I've suddenly realised with horror was 15 years ago, she features on the front cover. And the book is about basically Labour troublemakers who are never going to get on in politics. And of the 7 people on the front cover, I've realised that 3 are now dead. One has become obsessed with Hitler, and the other three are Dennis Skinner, Diane, and some bearded man who I remember when the book came out, it was reviewed by some obscure conservative website, and the person reviewing it didn't know who this bearded man was. He is now leader of the Labour Party. So let's start, if we can, by going back to 1987. When you came into Parliament, there were just 41 women, and you were one of just 4 black or Asian MPs, and the first black woman ever elected. What was that like, and how has the experience of being in Parliament changed as the demographics within Parliament have changed over time since then?
You're right. When I came in 1987, there were only 41 women altogether, and a lot of them actually were in their 50s and 60s. At 33, I was both the only black woman, but also one of the youngest people in Parliament. But let me just take a step back and say, because I can see people in the audience who probably weren't born when I first became a member of Parliament. My parents came to this country from Jamaica in the 1960s. They came from rural Jamaica. They both left school at 14. My mother came to this country and was a nurse. My father worked in a factory, and they could never, ever have imagined their daughter would be a British Member of Parliament. I mean, it's important to say that it was a big leap from my background to being an MP. And before I was actually elected, I think the thing that I was probably known for was campaigning around race, really. We set up the black sections of the Labour Party. I got very involved in a campaign on stop and search with a young black man called Paul Boateng, who's now Lord Boateng in the House of Lords. So what was it like? Well, in a way, what was it like for Parliament? They were in shock. Because you have to remember that when I entered Parliament in 1987, not only had there not been any black or minority ethnic MPs since the turn of the century, not only were there no black or minority ethnic MPs, you didn't see black or minority ethnic people serving in the cafeterias or the restaurants. MPs didn't employ black or minority ethnic staff. You didn't see black or minority ethnic attendance. And I remember having been there a little while and having a friend in for tea. And as we sort of walked round and went to the tea room, she said to me, "Diane, you do realise they're all looking at you?" And I said, "No, actually, because having spent, and we may come back to this, having spent my life on the long march through the institutions, I just screened out people looking at me in this way." So I think, and the thing was, it was a big shock for the institution, which was basically white at every level, as I say, cafeteria staff, attendants, policemen, and they were quite nervous because those of you that have studied 18th century, 19th century history will remember when the first Sinn Féin MPs got elected to Parliament, the Fenians. And the Fenians caused such chaos, keeping people up at night, keeping debates going forever. So they're very nervous to be like the Fenians. But the speaker, when we all turned up, was a man called Speaker Wetherell, Bernard Wetherell. And he thought he had the answer. And our leader, our de facto leader, because he was the oldest, was someone who's now passed away, Bernie Grant. So what Bernard Wetherell did is he would have Bernie Grant for glasses of port, because he felt if you offered him port, that would make him feel part of the system. But it was, in a sense, more of a shock to Parliament, us turning up there, than it was to us.
And as the numbers increased, I mean, a big jump on the Labour side in '97, and then sort of catching up slightly on the Conservative side, more women, and on both sides of the House, more on black and minority ethnic MPs. How has that changed things within the institution?
Well, the numbers have only increased painfully slowly. I was elected in 1987, the first black woman ever elected. The next black woman that got elected was Una King, and it took 10 years for Una King to enter Parliament in '97. And then I think Dawn Butler came in, I think it was 2000
I think in 2001, because I think she lost in 2005 and then came back in 2010.
Yeah.
I think, or the other way around.
So actually, what I would say is if you told me in 1987 that the numbers of black and minority ethnic MPs would rise so slowly, I would have been surprised. That's what would have been the surprising thing.
Do your experiences, and actually when you talk about your parents' background as well, do they make you more sympathetic, or maybe less sympathetic, I don't know, to those who are currently arguing that there's not enough working class MPs and that Parliament's become too much of a middle class institution?
Well, it is an issue, the composition of Parliament. When I first became an MP in '87, there were many more members of Parliament who had been coal miners, factory workers, trade unionists, and politics has become more professionalised. But I don't think there's a conflict between saying we've got to have more black MPs and more women MPs, we've got to have more working class MPs. I mean, I think some of us as women MPs would say we come from working class backgrounds too.
One obvious difference from when you came in is the rise of social media. And you wrote a piece for The Guardian recently about the abuse that you get on social media. And actually I was reading the piece today again before meeting you and debating with myself whether to read out some of the stuff which you included in the article. And the debate is simply that it's pretty vile stuff. The other argument seems to be that, or to me anyway, is that, and presumably this is why you wrote it in the article, that actually when you actually read it, as opposed to hearing that someone has had abuse, which sounds not very nice, but, you know, take it on the chin and move on. When you actually read some of the stuff that people send to you and that you put in this article, I mean, it is breathtakingly vile. I'm not going to read it out, but unless you decide you want to. I mean, do you think these people have always been there and they've never had a platform before? Or does it actually embolden people with these attitudes, this ability somehow to contact you? Because presumably you must have always have had greening letters and abuse. And so what is it that's changed?
Racism has always been there. When I first ran in '87, one of the first things that happened is somebody threw a brick through my campaign office window. And we've always had people writing us racist letters, maybe one a week, maybe a couple of months. What has happened with the new media is the whole thing has just exploded. And the key is partly, 20 years ago, if you wanted to be abusive to an MP, you had to write a letter, put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, put it in the postbox. Now, you just press a button and send your rape threats and say that you're, and tell you that you're a vile nigger bitch and you deserve to die. And that's literally the type of stuff that my office sees on an almost daily basis. So I think partly it's a lot easier. I think partly people have always felt like that, but it's easier now. And the anonymity is a big thing. And also people see other people doing it and feel emboldened. And my view about the kind of racist abuse I get online, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Facebook or whatever, my view was always that being an MP is a privilege. There, but for the grace of God, I'd be on the 16th floor of a tower block in Hackney looking after my grandchildren. Therefore, I had no right to complain. But things reached a kind of crescendo around the Brexit vote. There was a stupid story in the Daily Mail about David Davis and that. And so I think something came in. I didn't realise at the time. Something came in. And one of my staff, who's a real tough nut because she came up through student politics, she saw the email and she just burst into tears. It was so horrible. And it was my staff that persuaded me, this can't go on, Diane, you have to call it out. So I've never gone to my local party members and complained, I've never gone public and complained, but for the first time I read the piece of The Guardian, tried to spell out, because it seemed to me that how can you expect younger women, actually of any colour, to go into the public space if they're going to get vile abuse? I mean, really vile, not you're stupid. I mean, that's part of the course in Parliament. But really vile rape threats, death threats. I had somebody who had all these pornographic pictures of black women. What is it? Doing what they call the Blackwall Tunnel shot. The legs are wide open. So he got all these different pornographic issues of black women. He put my face on them and he emailed them to male MPs. And we only found out about it when some male MPs said, we just got this, what is this? So it just seemed to me that whatever my feeling, which is that you kind of have to tough it out, it was horrible for my staff, really horrible and distressing. And we were in a world where it was actually increasingly difficult now for women to go into the public space because of the abuse they get. I mean, I'm talking about Twitter and Facebook and emails. We get a lot of emails. But if you go on some of these sites, Comment History, The Guardian, and you go below the line.
Never look below the line.
Never
look below the line.
It's just awful.
Yeah.
And young women say to me, I'd like to do something for The Guardian, Comment History, but I can't face all the abuse.
I mean, I'm sure it's true that it's worse for women and black women. But actually, talking to male MPs, I mean, they seem to get a lot of pretty vile stuff as well. It's different, and it doesn't have the rape threats and so on, but it does have some death threats, and it's pretty vile for everyone. And I mean, you say in the piece, and you mentioned it again then, that you say in the article that maybe even a young, fearless Diane Abbott would have paused for thought about going into politics. And I do find myself in the same thought that why would anybody put them, male, female, white or black, put themselves up for this sort of abuse?
Yeah, because what it is, people think that if you're a politician, you're somehow dehumanised. And abuse they wouldn't address, even to people they didn't like. They can address it to you because you're not human and somehow you deserve, the threats and so on. It's really difficult. And actually abuse has replaced actual debate. And if people wonder, because yesterday we triggered Article 50 and we're coming out of the EU, and if people wonder how that happened, I think it's partly because we've got quite to a degree, a degraded form of political debate.
Another piece I read, thinking about things to ask you tonight, was a fascinating profile that Stephen Bush wrote in the New Statesman. of you. And one theme that he begins with, but that runs through the entire article, is that for almost your entire career, you've been underestimated. And that includes pre-politics. He starts with the anecdote at your school where the teacher told you, don't bother with Cambridge. You're not quite up to Cambridge. And you decide you are up to Cambridge, and you get into Cambridge. Why do you think that is?
Why do you think my teacher didn't think I was
No. Well, maybe with the specific, but I meant more generally. Why is it?
It's very obvious. We still live in a society where if you're a black woman and you walk into a meeting, people are more likely to think that you've come to serve the tea than to be a professional taking part in the meeting. It is what it is. I mean, as you say, when I was at school, it was a grammar school, but it didn't send that many people to university, and it hardly sent anyone to Oxford and Cambridge. But I got into my head in a stubborn way that I wanted to go to Cambridge, and when I asked my teacher, because in those days, in order to go to Oxford or Cambridge, you had to sit a special exam. And if you're a state school student, what you had to do was literally stay on for another term, because state schools didn't tutor you for that exam. So you finished your year and did your A-levels, then you came back and stayed on for another term or a term and a half. And in those days, which tells you how far back this was, over 30 years, in order to do an art subject at Cambridge or Oxford, and when I say arts, I don't mean fine art, I mean history, English, German, history, whatever. In order to do an art subject, you had to do a Latin paper. Now you're looking a bit blank. Why a Latin paper? One of the things it did actually is it made it harder for state school children to go to Oxford and Cambridge. Perhaps it was a way of sieving us out. So I had to go and art. It wasn't just a question of me filling in a form. It wasn't just a question of me putting Cambridge on my UCA form. I had to go to my teacher and say, I want to do the Oxford and Cambridge exam. And she had to agree to tutor me for a further term and a half. And as you say, she looked at me and she said, I don't think you're up to it. And I said, and these were fateful words, but I think I'm up to it, and that's what matters, isn't it? So at pivotal points in my life, I found from somewhere the courage to challenge people's assumptions about black people. But those assumptions are still out there.
Someone who hasn't underestimated you is the leader of the Labour Party. And in the same Stephen Bush piece, he says, Abbott is one of the few people in the Parliamentary Labour Party whom Corbyn trusts, fully trusts. But then he quotes you, and I thought this was a fascinating quote. He quotes you saying, the thing that can be infuriating about Jeremy is that he likes to think the best of everyone, which in itself is a phrase that implies that often you don't always think the best of everyone. And you go on, I'm perfectly straight with him as to what I think, and even if he doesn't believe me at the time, he always does come round to my point of view. And reading that, and I mean this as a compliment, there's a bit more of a fighter about you than there is about him, isn't there?
Well, I suppose I'm going to fight it in a different way. Because if your parents left school at 14 and they emigrated to this country in the 1960s, and for the first few years of your life, you lived in one room in a house in Paddington, and you live to be a Labour Member of Parliament and Shadow Home Secretary, you have to be a fighter in a very specific way. But Jeremy has always fought for the things he believes in, but it is a fact. Jeremy always likes to think the best of people. I think after all the abuse he's had from Labour MPs in the media, he's a little bit more worldly wise now, but it's been a sharp learning curve for him.
But you might reject this characterisation, but he was more conciliatory, I think, at the beginning towards people in the PLP who he knew hadn't backed him and he knew who didn't want him to be leader, maybe than you were. I mean, you were urging him to be tougher, and from the beginning.
I was more sceptical. The thing about Jeremy was he didn't necessarily know everybody in the PLP, in a way. You know, Jeremy, he campaigned on the things he really cared about. You know, he never goes into House of Commons bars or House of Commons dining rooms. And he just wanted to believe the best. But if you see a little more of them, I'm not saying I spend all my time in House of Commons past, but I perhaps mixed a little more, I perhaps mixed a little bit more with MPs than he did. You know, you have to be sceptical.
You also gave an interview to The Independent recently in which you said, they asked you what your best moment in politics was in all the time you've been in the House of Commons. And you said it was the 1997 election victory, Tony Blair's first landslide victory in 97. Now, there's an obvious irony there, which I might come on to in a minute. But before we talk about the irony, I don't know why you laughed. Or maybe I do. If that was the best moment, what was the worst?
Do you know, I don't want to go into any detail, and it was a few years ago, but it was to do with some media row, and it wasn't to do with my son, in fact, but it was some stupid media row. But I just had enough, and I thought, I can't take this anymore, you know, I'm sick of this, people just think they can say what they like, the media are hounding me, and I rang up one of the people that I came into Parliament with, Keith Vass, who in his own way has proved extremely resilient because he has quite an interesting private life. But anyway, I rang Keith and I said, I've had enough, I'm going to step down, la 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 la. And Keith was just like, he said, Diane, he said, you have forgotten what it took for us to get here. You're not standing down, you're going to do A, B, C, D, E. And I did A, B, C, D, E. And 15 years later, I'm still here. But the thing about the 97 election, it wasn't because it was Tony Blair, it was because it was the Labour Party. You're all reading in the papers how the Labour Party is finished, how, you know, it's never going to win power again. Well, you see, I came into politics in the 80s when people were saying the exact same thing. The Labour Party was over. It was a party which many people will not have heard of, the SDP. Apparently that was going to take over as the opposition party. And I came into politics when people were saying the Labour Party could never win another election. And that had practical consequences. When I first became an MP, there were very many schools in Hackney in a terrible state of disrepair, water coming through the ceiling, they had to have buckets. You know, Hackney now is, some of you may live that side, Hackney now is very sort of chic and hipster, but it wasn't like that in the early 80s. And it meant so much having come in at a point when people said my party could not win again, to win resoundingly in 97. Because in the end, in politics, it's got to be about improving people's lives. And whatever went wrong with New Labour, and some things did go wrong, the truth is that with a Labour government, you can improve people's lives in a way that is not possible otherwise. And at the end of 3 terms of Labour government, we had new schools, we had investment in hospital, we had a new overground. For me, politics is about people, and in the end, being able to improve their lives. And the fact we had a Labour government for the first time since I was an MP in 97, it was an exhilarating moment.
But listening to you, I'll come on to the question I was going to ask in a minute, but listening to you, I could have been listening then to any one of dozens of New Labour MPs who would say exactly the same thing. And actually, I could be listening to any of dozens of the MPs who say the Labour leadership must change because we have to win in order to do these things.
It's about power for a purpose. And the difference between me and some of the New Labour MPs you were talking about is they went on to vote for the Iraq War, which was wrong, and we knew it was wrong at the time, and I didn't. Of course you want your party to win, but sometimes you have to say, my party is doing the wrong thing. And the Iraq War was one of the examples where New Labour did the wrong thing. But did I want my party to win? No. There's a kind of propaganda in New Labour that anybody that stood up to Tony Blair is because they weren't real Labour people, they didn't want the party to win. Of course we want the party to win. You know, Hackney, as I said, is a lot slicker, a lot more hipster now, but it still has estates and it still has some of the worst poverty in Europe. So, you know, we see these people every Friday at my advice session. So I'm a Labour person for a reason, because Tariq Ali, who you will have heard of, but maybe some of the audience don't have.
Are you implying I'm old?
No. I'm implying you're a political scientist. Tariq Ali said the difference between the worst Labour government and the best Conservative government, no, the difference between the best, let me get this straight. The difference between the worst Labour government and the best Conservative government is like this small. But it's in that gap that we all live. I believe that organised politics, people coming together, can actually make a difference and is worth committing yourself to.
Okay, so if we go back to 97,
Yeah.
which is now almost 20 years ago, and we're coming up to the 20th anniversary. This time, 20 years ago, Labour were polling 54%. They were ahead of the Conservatives by 24 percentage points. Labour are currently polling 25% and are trailing the Conservatives by 18 points in opposition in mid-term. Now, in December, you gave an interview in which you said you expect to see the gap close in the next 12 months. And we're now about 4 months into those 12 months. And if anything, the gap is growing still. So do you still expect to see the gap closed? In the next 8 months?
Of course. As I said to you, when I became an MP in 1987, people like you, and by which I mean political scientists, were saying that Labour could never win again. And within 10 years, not only did we win, but we went on to win 3 successive general elections and actually make a lot of changes for the better in people's lives. Since Jeremy got elected as leader of the party in 2015, he has had the type of press coverage that I've never seen before. We thought the way they treated Kinnock was bad, right? We thought the way they treated Ed Miliband was bad. But the way the media has treated Jeremy is just quite extraordinary. But to add insult to injury, there was a period for at least a year when Labour MPs were in the media day after day saying he was completely unelectable. It's not surprising that our polling isn't great. It is now the case that Labour MPs are calming down a bit, so we'll see where the polls are in 6 months' time. But you can't have a politics. You know, we now have the biggest social democratic party in Europe. We have a party which is touching 500,000. We've lost a few, but we're touching 500,000, which is a huge number of members. Like, you know, we never had that number of members under Tony Blair or Ed Miliband or anything else. And you can't have a politics where ordinary people get together and say, you know, we believe in peace abroad and social justice at home, and try and select a leader that speaks for that, and then that person is driven out of office by malign and often simply false media and MPs. And I know I'm being recorded, so I'm careful what I'm going to say about my colleagues, right? But MPs who seem to think it's more important to attack someone that's been elected twice in 12 months than to get together and try and get a victory for our party in a few years.
Just to prove that social media is not all bad, today I asked for suggestions for questions on social media to ask you. And here is one that I thought was good. They weren't all good. Take a seat like Portsmouth North, working class seat that Labour must win in order to, and Labour has won in recent memory, and Labour needs to win in order to have a majority. What are the top 3 policies that Labour is putting forward that are going to help win Portsmouth North?
Well, I would say one of the problems with seats like Portsmouth North is in the recent past, they were seats which depended on heavy industry manufacturing for jobs. And one of the things that we want to do is invest in the economy as well. One of the problems of the Thatcher years and then the New Labour years was the British economy got skewed to banking and financial services in the city, and areas of the country which are dependent on manufacturing or potteries or making cars or mining found themselves marginalised and gradually going downhill. We want to invest in those areas to help to bring them up economically. We want to build housing. Do you know, I bought my first flat when I was 28. It was in Maida Vale, before Maida Vale is as posh as it is now. It cost me £21,000. And I was able to buy it. I didn't have a particularly, well-paid job. I was able to buy it. I didn't have any money after I bought it, so I spent the winter. I couldn't afford much furniture. I spent the winter sleeping on a mattress in my living room. But I bought that flat. Now that possibility is not open to young people in London and possibly young people in Portsmouth North. One thing Jeremy is very committed to, because Islington is like Hackney, is an area with ridiculous rents and buying is out of the question, is to build more social housing and to invest in housing so people can have the opportunity for a home of their own, which I had when I was 28. So I think jobs, I think housing, and I think the National Health Service. I mean, we have to construct policies as to how we would invest in the National Health Service. But let me tell you, I feel very strong about the National Health Service. My mother came here as a pupil nurse. You will hear people, maybe people in this audience will say, oh, immigrants, on the drain, on the social services. Without immigrants, a city like London wouldn't have many of these social services. My mother's generation of us helped to build the NHS, and we are seeing the Tories are moving, whatever they say, they're moving inexorably to something much more like the American system, where if you don't have a credit card, you don't necessarily get the coverage. So I think those two things, jobs, housing and NHS, if we can get our message across, that is what will help us win in seats like Portsmouth.
Two of those in particular provoke a thought in me that I've had before, which is what I call the sort of one of the Corbyn paradoxes, which is that there is all this talk about how sort of crazily left-wing Labour's policies are going to be. But on most policy areas, there isn't an awful lot of difference between current Labour position, the sort of things you just set out, and what Ed Miliband was talking about in 2015. I mean, Labour's current house building target is, I think, exactly the same as Ed Miliband's 2015 manifesto. Stuff on the NHS about, reducing private sector involvement was in 2015's manifesto. I mean, how is it actually different?
I was a junior minister under Ed Miliband, and Ed Miliband's a really nice guy, who again was treated quite badly by the press. But the NHS, he wasn't prepared to say that he wanted to roll back the privatisation of the NHS, because under New Labour, we had opened the door to private sector investment in the NHS. On housing, he wasn't committed to the numbers of social housing that Jeremy is committed to. And in terms of investment, Ed Balls believed that, in effect, we had to go along with Tory austerity. But there is a point about what you're saying, which is that you will read in The Sun, you will read in the Express, you might even read The Guardian, that Jeremy is some crazy extremist. Actually, he stands for policies that in the rest of Western Europe will be seen as mainstream social democratic policies. It's only because politics in this country has moved to the right that people are walking around saying that it's crazy extremism.
Let me ask you one more policy question, and then we throw it open to questions, which is immigration, where we know, I think, there are some questions within the leadership about how you respond to issues relating to Brexit and immigration as a policy more generally. And here's another contrast with the Miliband era, which is the famous mug with controls on immigration on it, which you at the time that came out, you called it shameful and an embarrassment. Keir Starmer just announced that one of Labour's 6 tests for Brexit is, does it ensure the fair management of migration in the interests of the economy and communities? Surely fair management of immigration is controls on immigration, isn't it?
Let me look. Since 2010, there's been a wing in the Labour Party that believes that the answer to winning back support in post-industrial Britain is to move right on immigration. They've been saying it since 2010. And I was a leadership candidate in the 2010 leadership election. And at the beginning of that leadership campaign, Ed Balls, Andy Burnham, Ed Miliband, they were all saying, in effect, we had to move right on immigration. They stopped saying that as the campaign wore on because they realised Labour Party members didn't appreciate that as a narrative. The problem with pandering to people's fears around migration is that it's a loser's game. I am not saying that there are not real fears about immigration. I'm not saying that I don't meet second and third generation immigrants complaining about immigrants. You know, it is in the nature of things for the second to last generation of immigrants to complain about the latest lot of immigrants. But the idea that immigrants are responsible to say to the NHS, immigrants are the reason you can't get a job, immigrants are responsible for low wages. You know what causes low wages? Predatory employers, globalisations, and increasingly weakened trade unions. I say in public and in private that anti-immigrant politics is a dead end for the Labour Party. It's very difficult to make that case now because you've got Trump across the Atlantic basically peddling the same thing to working people. Immigrants are the source of your problems. But what we have to do as a party is to fashion policies on immigration, which, yes, are good for the society and good for the economy. Who'd want policies on immigration that were bad for the society and bad for the economy?
Okay, but that does mean control. I mean, this is not about pandering. It's about it does mean control, though, doesn't it?
Well, just to say that we've never had uncontrolled immigration. No. The last time, if you take the EU out of it, the last time we had uncontrolled immigration in this country was 1963 when we introduced the Commonwealth Immigration Act. One of the problems about immigration is there's so many myths. We've not had uncontrolled immigration since 1963, but people, including your good self, talk about it. Of course we have control on immigration. We've had them for, actually, probably, since soon after the Second World War. The point is that our immigration system should be fair. You see, when people talk about immigration, as a Hackney MP, one of the biggest parts of my work is dealing with individual immigration problems. People that have come here to work, people that want to bring relatives in, people that want their auntie in for a wedding. And I cannot overstate the unfairness, the cruelty, and the chaos of our immigration system. So I'm never one that says you shouldn't have immigration controls, because this country's always had immigration controls. But partly because I was a Home Office civil servant, the first thing I did when I came down from Cambridge was as I was a graduate trainee with the Home Office. I feel very strongly about the chaos and the cruelty of our immigration system. And as Shadow Home Secretary and hopefully Home Secretary, that is something I would seek to deal with. And clearly, when we come out of the EU, and it's when, not if, then freedom of movement, which is an EU thing, falls. There may be a transitional period, but it falls. So then what Labour has to do is have an immigration policy which covers both EU nationals and non-EU nationals. And it's an opportunity, as far as I'm concerned, to construct an immigration policy which is actually fair and even-handed and efficient. And
by even-handed, you would mean broadly treating EU nationals and non-EU nationals on an equal basis?
Absolutely. If you're going to distinguish between immigrants, it should be on the basis of their skills or maybe prior connections with this country. But if you have, and I'm afraid I've had to explain this to colleagues, if you have one set of immigration controls for EU nationals, another set of immigration controls for non-EU nationals, what you have in effect is one set of immigration controls for white people and another set of immigration controls for black people. And I suspect that would be legally challengeable.
And if we go down that, follow the logic of that route, that would mean presumably that any immigration controls we had with EU nationals of the remaining EU states, which some people want to keep fairly relaxed in order to try and keep the freedom of movement that people have seen over the last 30 or 40 years, the logic of that would lead to equally relaxed liberal immigration for non-EU nationals.
Relaxed and liberal are subjective terms. And one of the problems about immigration is people use subjective terms. I think we want fair and efficient processes. I have people that literally, they put in their asylum claim, they wait for years and years, and they have to put their lives on hold. I think it's not helpful to use subjective terms like relax, because the next stage after saying relax is just saying, oh my word, she wants. I'm saying fair.
Well, fair, that's a subjective term too.
No, I'm a Home Office civil servant, I know what fair means.
Okay, one last question, then we'll throw it open. But since you mentioned the Labour leadership contest, one of my favourite statistics about leadership contests, and it's probably sad that I have a ranking of statistics about leadership contests, but my favourite statistic about leadership contests is that in every single Labour leadership contest to feature men and women, men have always beaten women. No woman has ever polled higher than a man in any Labour leadership contest. In every Conservative leadership contest to feature men and women, women have beaten men, and no man has ever outpolled a woman in a Conservative leadership contest. Why do you think the Conservatives manage that and Labour doesn't?
But why are you saying that as a political scientist? Because in 2010, when I ran for the leadership, we still had an electoral college, which meant that Labour MPs literally had thousands of votes. Trade unionists had votes. Some people had 7 votes. Some people had none. And the truth is that had the 2010 leadership election been fought on a one-person, one-vote system, yes, Ed Miliband would come top, and David Miliband would have come second, but I would have come third, over Ed Balls, over Anti-Burnham. So it's not so much that Labour members won't vote for women, it's that we've been lumbered for some time with an elaborate system which made it hard for the populist candidate to come through. But in the 2010 leadership election, I would have come third.
I have the table here because I suspected you were against that. In fact, I added them up earlier today just to check. And you're right, you beat Ed Balls by about 700 votes if you work it out on that basis.
That's right.
So let me rephrase it. Why is it that the best a woman has ever done in a Labour leadership contest is come third, and yet in 2 Conservative leadership contests, women have come both first and second?
Well, you're a political scientist, so you will know that both in the case of Margaret Thatcher and in the case of Theresa May, the men that, particularly Thatcher actually, the men that ran their campaigns didn't necessarily expect them to win. And the extraordinary thing about Theresa May's victory, I think, is that after, Boris and Gove and Cameron and everybody knifed each other up, the stage is awash with blood, and Theresa May is the last man standing. I think that it's not the case. I mean, I'm in Parliament 5 days a week, It's not the case that the Tory party is miraculously less sexist than the Labour Party, but it is the case that women have emerged, often to the surprise of everyone around them, in the Tory party. But then you have to ask yourself, certainly that's what I would ask myself as a feminist all my political career, was Mrs. Thatcher a better Prime Minister for women than any of the men she beat would have done. Because it's not, I believe in representation. I believe in more women in Parliament. I believe in more black and minority ethnic people in Parliament. But I also believe that being there is about delivering. And the truth is that under Mrs. Thatcher, they had fewer women in the cabinet than under men before her. So it's an interesting idiosyncrasy of the political system, but it doesn't point to the fact that the Labour Party is intrinsically more sexist than the Tories.
And a very final follow-up question on this, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Which party do you think will first deliver a black Prime Minister, and within what time span would you expect that to happen?
You know, I can remember in the 70s, maybe 76, maybe 77, Mrs. Thatcher on any questions, and she was asked, you know, would we ever see a woman Prime Minister? And she said, oh no, not in my lifetime. And in 18 months, she was the leader of the Conservative Party.
It must have been before 75.
Yeah.
But it's in the 70s. It's in the 70s.
Basically, she said it, and in 18 months, she was leader of her party. I can also remember, in the run-up to the 2008 US presidential election, a lot of people were still saying a black man could become president of the United States. So I'm not going to prophesy, because people that prophesy these things get them wrong, and you've always got to expect the unexpected in politics.
But which party?
I'm not going to prophesy.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. Let's take some Q&A. We've got some roving mics. We do ask, please, that people speak into the mic, so that way we can record what is said rather than just the answer, which means it's a little bit less one-sided. So let's take the chat. She has got a microphone, so we will check that something's not gone wrong. Well, while I'm getting the first mic up to the question, we will get Diane's mic checked, Gary, if we can. It's working. Right, okay. It is working. Don't worry, Diane. The chap in the sort of white T-shirt at the back there, yeah. He's got his hand furiously in the air. He looks like he's going to burst. Yeah.
Hello. Okay. With the Conservatives recently having kind of shifted off to the right, Labour having shifted off to the left, with many people saying that Labour aren't doing a great job as the official opposition, the Lib Dems have kind of capitalised on this with the highest membership for about 20 years. They've been winning council by-elections up across the country, reversed the 23,000 majority in Richmond Park. I know it's small steps, but are you worried?
I'll tell you what, we'll take a batch of questions. I could answer that one for her. Let's take this chap. If we could come down to this chap here with the beard, that'd be great.
Hi, I'd like to ask, do you think there are less barriers for ethnic minorities for getting into politics now compared to the 1980s?
Okay, and I would love to see a woman's hand go up there. It is allowed. There we go. Yeah.
Why is there never a female Chancellor of the Exchequer, and why are females considered so fiscally incompetent?
Right. Diane, are you frightened of the Lib Dems?
No.
Okay. How about the
it is easier. I mean, the four of us got elected. I'm just looking at my mic. Four of us got elected in '87, and then it was 10 years before we had anybody else. But we now have, I don't know, is it 12?
It's 4%, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think so.
It has very gradually got easier. I mean, the Tories now have 1, 2, 3, 4 African men. So it has got easier, but it's still hard. That's what I'd say. And the other question, why isn't there a female chancellor? You know, when I came into politics, And this was, I became an MP just as after Mrs. Thatcher became leader of a party. Women MPs, they didn't get to be chancellor, they didn't get to be Home Secretary. Mostly women MPs did education. And what I've seen in 30 years in Parliament is actually the range of jobs that women MPs get to do is much broader than when I first came into Parliament. And I have every expectation in my lifetime we'll have a woman chancellor.
Okay, let's take one in the front there. That'd be great.
I've been a Labour member for 8 years, and I voted for Jeremy twice, and I actually voted for you, Diane, in 2010. Do you think that Momentum's campaign for the deselection of Labour MPs is the right answer? Because we know the PLP is a problem, but do you think that's the right answer?
We'll take Lloyd in the sort of tweedy jacket and it is tweed, Lloyd. It is tweed.
I thought you very correctly put out a deadline or a time period as when you'd like to see things improve, and obviously you think they will and you hope they will, but I think it would be only sensible to have a plan B, and if you reach this deadline and what you hope and sincerely think will happen doesn't, what next? Or do you just say, let's have another 12 months, or do you then have to take a different course of action?
Okay, and yes, up just behind you, up there. That'd be great.
Hello. Okay. Hi. You referred quite a lot to the 80s, and I wasn't there. But do you think that with the political lean to the right within Europe and also across the pond, and the pressure, do you think that's going to make it harder for Labour than their fight in the 80s to get into power and to get more members and to get support? Thank you.
Okay, so the first one was about Momentum and their campaign. Second one is the time, that 8 months left of the 12 months, and then that was about the difference between now and the 80s and whether actually it's tougher for Labour now than it was in the 80s, however tough it felt in the 1980s. How about starting with Momentum?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a big Momentum group in Hackney. They're fine. They just want to get involved and keep Jeremy as leader and help the Labour Party win. There's too much rubbish in the papers about Momentum, actually. That Momentum are a conspiracy and they want to get rid of MPs. That's why I don't think that should be their focus. And actually, the Momentum people I know, that is not their focus. The truth is, we've had this huge expansion of membership, and I think Momentum has a positive role to play in getting those members involved. I mean, in Stoke, which we won, and at one point people were saying we couldn't win Stoke because it was one of the most UKIP areas in the country, right? And we won. And I think in the last week of the election, the by-election, Momentum flooded people into Stoke, and there was one night when they knocked on every single door. I think Momentum, in as much as they're trying to get people who have been infused by politics, by Jeremy. I mean, you've been in the party for 8 years, but I meet people all the time who say, and not just young people, but old people, I joined because of Jeremy, and I voted twice. And what Momentum is trying to do is get those people involved in the party, and I think that's the right thing. And I think they get a bad rap, actually, Momentum. What happens if the polling doesn't improve in a year? Do I have a plan B? Well, let me put it to you like this. If I had a plan B, I wouldn't tell you. Is it tougher for the party now? Not really, because you know what? Politics is about power. And people who have power never want to let it go. And if you are the sort of Labour Party which isn't really a threat to the status quo, people might be a bit nice to you. But if they think for a second that you are a big threat to the status quo and a big threat to the people who have power, if you go down the road from this uni, the City of London, then you're going to get the most vicious pushback. It was hard in the 80s, it's hard now, but we came through the 80s and we won, and I have confidence we can come through this period.
Well, just picking up on the Momentum point,
Yeah.
I also sense maybe lurking beneath your answer that you think some of those MPs who are complaining about Momentum branches causing them trouble and pushing for deselection kind of just need to take it on the chin, because 10, 15 years ago, there were people on the right trying to get people like you deselected, and that's just politics.
No, I don't think that. Although it is true that under Blair, people were trying to get me deselected. But no, I don't think Momentum should be talking about deselecting people. These are my colleagues.
But where they are, which they are in some places,
How many Momentum people do you know? There you go, right?
No, I was counting them up. I was counting them up.
There
I was
you
counting them up. Okay. Right, let's take some more questions. Gosh, lots of hands now. Okay. I can see D up there, please. Yeah. No, a bit further up. Yeah, there you go. Lovely.
Hello. I want to ask you about what you said about toughing it out on kind of discriminatory comments, and also about representation, because I'm a disabled woman on a 0 hours contract, and I don't feel represented by the people in Parliament. And I understand that you have to tough it out, but I don't think that we shouldn't say the things we need to say, because disabled people get a really bad deal in this country, and we need to stand up for those people. I suppose what I'm really asking you is, I'm a union rep myself, and I went to a meeting where a black woman came into the meeting, and I asked her why she didn't come to the meetings before, and she said not because they thought I was a cleaner or anything like that. She said because there were no other black members there. So I think the issue is that we do need more disabled people, more women, and more black people in our parliament representing us. And I also think that I'd like to know a bit more about why you think the left seems to have a problem in having a female Labour leader, because I don't see that you've answered that question for me. Thank you.
Okay, let's take that chap there, please.
Hiya. We've seen it in the US, and unfortunately we're seeing it here as well. With the Labour Party, with the Labour Party in general, underplaying issues which people regard as general issues, such as radicalisation or immigration. Do you not feel that as a result you're losing and you're alienating people from communities who are affected by these issues? I mean, we have seen a loss of support by Labour in places like the old mining towns, etc., where issues such as immigration are a huge issue to the people, but Labour is consistently underplaying these issues, saying, don't worry about it. Or worse, members of Labour calling them, you're just racist for not, for whichever reason.
Okay, and let's take. I can see you are going to burst. You are going to burst, but we'll come to you in the next round. We'll take this chap here, please, Steve.
Hi, Diane. Like you, I can remember quite a lot of events in the 80s and early 90s of losing elections. What I would say to you is, at the same time as a result, you can kind of see what's going to happen here. There's a risk that we have 15 years before we do see a Labour government again. And, we're old enough to have seen what needs to happen to get a Labour government. As you said yourself, the country has moved, sadly, for better or worse, towards the right. And we've seen before that you need a more centrist policy agenda for a Labour government to get elected. And to be honest, I would rather have a slightly more right Labour Party in government than a very hard right Conservative Party in government for the next 15 years. Okay,
in whatever order you want, Diane.
I think I wasn't clear to the lady that asked the first question. I'm not saying that women should put up with discrimination. I'm not saying black people should put up with discrimination either. I mean, I've fought my whole life. I came into politics campaigning around stop and search, around race. One of the first things I did as a young woman, before I even joined the Labour Party, is I used to volunteer every week at a youth club and work with young women. So I'm the last person that says people just put up with discrimination. I was just saying that for me, I've always thought it's important not to complain. It was only when it reached a pitch, that I felt something had to be said. There aren't many disabled members of Parliament. I'm trying to think. There was David Blunkett. There was a Scottish...
Anne Begg.
There was Anne Begg, and currently Harlow. You know who I mean?
Yeah, Robert Helpham.
Yeah. So there aren't many disabled members of Parliament, and there should be more. And the key is that Parliament overall should look like the people it represents. That was what will help people to relate to us as an entity. And that does mean more women, more black people, more disabled people, more working class people, because that's become an issue since I've been an MP. But I certainly wasn't saying that black people and women should endure abuse and discrimination silently. I was just talking about my unwillingness as somebody who is relatively privileged at this point to complain. Immigration in mining towns. Are you from mining towns? Okay, good. Look. Yeah, I know. Okay, this thing, it was what I referred to earlier. This idea that the answer, and you might say the only answer, to winning PAG Labour votes in post-industrial Britain, mining towns, manufacturing towns, potteries, is to move right on migration. And what I would say is this, that it is absolutely the case that Labour support has eroded in post-industrial Britain. But it's quite a complex question why that has happened. Part of what underlies it is the collapse of the industries that made towns like Stoke or Manchester or Halifax, that made them, the mining, the manufacturing, the potteries. And the problem for the Labour Party was this, that historically the Labour Party in those areas was actually quite small, because they were actually buttressed by a very high level of industrial organisation. But when the industry collapsed, you were left with relatively small, weak Labour Party, but you can no longer rely on the trade unions to organise people for them. It is a complex question why the post-industrial Britain we've lost support there. But I'll tell you something. I was on the National Executive Party in the 1990s. It was a different election system, and you could, as a left winger, get on the National Executive. So what I noticed in the run-up to the 97 election, we were doing all this polling. We were polling Middle England, we were polling middle-class housewives. And I said, why aren't we polling, in our core areas, in our heartland areas? And you know what Blair and the other people at NEC said to me? They said, Diane, those people have nowhere else to go. And it is that attitude to our core vote, and it's an attitude which goes back decades, which is, I think, behind some of the problems we have with so-called heartland Labour issues, heartland Labour areas today. And to simplifying it down to saying that if we only sounded more anti-immigrant, former miners and their children would be flocking back to vote for us, is not to understand what has happened to the former industrial heartlands of Britain. That's what I'd say to you. And the truth as well about immigration, it's all very well to say to people, I feel your pain. Immigrants are responsible for you not having a job, your children not having a job, you not being able to afford a house, and so on. Part of what is problematic about that is that historically in this country, immigrant has been used not just to refer to people that are subject to immigration control. People talk about immigrants when actually they mean refugees and asylum seekers. People talk about immigrants when actually the person they've seen is a student. People would see my son on the street, who is the third generation of his family, to carry a British passport and say, look, that's one of those immigrants. And the problem is, because people have this general sense of immigrants being the other, once you start saying to them, yes, immigrants are your problem, they are going to reasonably expect that in a very short time, they're going to see fewer people that they think are immigrants on a high street like them, a high street near them. But actually, how do you get fewer refugees and asylum seekers? We would have to come out of any number of European conventions. What do you do about people like my son who were born here and whose parents were born here? I repeat, pandering to anti-immigrant politics is a dead end for the Labour Party, but we do have to examine the neglect and complacency which eroded our vote in what used to be extremely safe seats like Stoke Central. Oh, okay.
And then there was... There was the question from the chap who is concerned that basically he's seen this story before and he knows how it ends.
Well, I mean, yeah, I've seen the story before, and I've told you how it ended. It ended with 3 successive election victories.
After 50 years of losses.
Well, it all, you know, people forget.
It was 18 years of...
18 years, 18 Tory years. Yeah. People forget, when they slag off Jeremy Corbyn, that when he won the first time, right, 2015, he ran against the best and the brightest that the Labour Party could offer. There was Andy Burnham, there was Yvette Cooper, there was Liz Kendall, and Labour Party, and they're all very nice people, I know them all, but guess what? Labour Party members looked at them and looked at them, Jeremy, and said, you know what, we're going to go for Jeremy. You have to tell me who is the leader. And it's all very well telling me, oh, the standard, the male says Jeremy's unelectable. You have to tell me then who it is that the Mail and the Standard would say were electable. The truth is, any Labour leader, and Ed Miliband, who was not as left-wing as Jeremy, you know, nice man, not as left-wing, Ed Miliband found that to his cost, any Labour leader that offers any sort of challenge to the status quo is going to be personally destroyed and denigrated by the mainstream media. And then people pick it up and say, Ed Miliband, he can't be elected. Jeremy's policies, taking the railways back into public ownership, you know, taking the privatisation out of the NHS, these are not unpopular policies. And we cannot allow the Daily Mail to tell us who the leader of the Labour Party should be. So, you know, yes, you can tell me what the Mail and the Standard and the Express say about the electability of our current leader. Yes, you can tell we've got to move to the right on immigration and whatever else in order to win. What I say is we have to learn from the past. We have to learn from the neglect of people, not just mining villages, but some of the people I represent or came to represent. We have to learn from past neglect. And we almost have to rebuild people's confidence in politics, the practice of politics, as something that can deliver for them. Because currently people don't believe that. And that's the real challenge, I think.
Okay, now, there was the man here I promised we'd go to because he clearly was going to explode if we didn't get to him. So we'll take him first.
Diane, you spoke very persuasively about not having to pander to anti-immigrant sentiment, but you also talked about a lot of the myths that are out there about immigration. And I'd say also Labour has a big problem with the economy, and there are a lot of myths about Labour's stance and Labour's track record on the economy. What are you guys in the Shadow Cabinet and in the strategy teams in Labour going to do about dispelling those myths? Because it feels like until those myths are out the way, you're not going to get a hearing on your policies. How are you going to persuade the public that these are myths and not facts?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, the Tories were very successful post-2010 and saying Labour was responsible for the international financial crash because we spent all the money. Now, it was clearly nonsense, but they managed to make it stick. And we're very conscious. I mean, the balance for us in economic policy is sounding credible, but also sounding radical. And it's a hard balance. But you're right. I consider myself on the left of politics. And at the heart of my left-wing politics is what you do about the economy. I think that's what makes the left different from the rest of the party. It's a very difficult period for social democratic parties all over Europe, but you're absolutely right. We have to persuade people who are credible, and we also have to have radical policies around spending. I mean, John McDonnell has done his best to transform himself into a friendly bank manager type figure, which if you know John McDonnell as well as I know John McDonnell, it's interesting. You know, you see him and you think, who are you? What have you done with John McDonnell? But anyway, no, you're right. I mean, I talked about myths about immigration because that's the thing people want to bring up. But the myths around Labour and the economy are actually much more pernicious.
It's difficult though, isn't it? I mean, Ed Balls has this spiel, which I've heard him give several times now, about how very early on in the Miliband years, they realised they had this perception problem. And they kept trying ways that you might try and challenge this perception. And no matter what they threw at it, the perception stuck. And Labour has traditionally always had this perception that it is a party that you might vote for because if you know, the heart tells you to vote for Labour, the head tells you to vote for the Conservatives. It's always the old cliche. And Labour's never really, other than that period after September 1992, Labour's never really managed to break out of that.
Well, you're a political scientist. You remember, immediately after the Second World War, the great, very left-wing actually, austerity chancellor, Stafford Cripps. It is not the case that Labour has not ever been able to convince people that it can manage the economy in a fair way. And I think one of the problems with the Miliband years was that, I mean, Ed Balls was lovely. Like the rest of you, I enjoyed watching him on Strictly. But I think our problem was that part of our problem was because he was so closely associated with Gordon Brown, it was very difficult to shake off those years because you had Gordon Brown's, as it were, Sorcerer's Apprentice on the front bench, sort of waving his fingers at David Cameron. But no, it's tough. It's tough.
Okay, we're going to take 3 final questions. We're going to take them, they're going to be very short, please. Then we're going to have some very short answers, and then we're going to have some drinks. And so that's a perfect combination to round off the evening. So we'll take one there, please, Dee, right to your side. No, the woman behind you. Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about people who have been like underrepresented in Parliament. What kind of are Labour or maybe Parliament going to be doing over the next few years to make sure that they are maybe in the next election more represented?
Okay, and the woman there, yes, please.
Hi. Earlier you said you weren't scared of the Lib Dems. As a Labour member who's seriously considering moving to the Lib Dems, I'm looking for a convincing argument not to. I'd like to hear what that is from you, Dan.
And then, we've got the Lib Dems in, have we? Right.
Yeah.
And then the chap with the tie, please. Yeah.
Thank you. You speak a lot about post-industrial Britain. Could you make a comment about post-service Britain? If 3 million people, post-service Britain, if 3 million people from the EU leave, and if, theoretically, some of the highest paying jobs in London move, all of these people are not going to have £3 coffees anymore. They won't be buying flats in Hackney worth £1 million. Isn't that going to affect Labour constituencies?
Okay, lovely, thank you. Right, Diane, final 3, and then we can have a glass of wine.
The question about representation is a long-standing one. As I told you, it's one of my campaigns when I became an MP 30 years ago. I mean, when I became an MP 30 years ago, as your professor pointed out, there were 42 women out of 650 MPs. What Labour did about that was it brought in a series of policies designed to increase the numbers of women. One of the things we did is we had all women shortlists. And so from 42 women in 87, most of whom actually were in their 50s, by 97, we had over 100 women in the Labour Party. The Labour Party has a record, actually, of not just talking the talk on representation, but actually doing things, taking positive action where necessary. On the question of race, we have had, I mean, since 2010, we have had more black and minority MPs. And I'll tell you something, Cameron, to be fair, don't want to be bad about, because he's a Tory, right? Cameron, to be fair, when he saw that we had so many women, and also quite a few black people, he went out of his way to recruit women and black candidates for Parliament, for the Conservatives. So the fact that the Labour Party was willing to do the brave thing and have positive action on women's shortlists and so on, meant that other parties had to follow along. The Lib Dems didn't follow along, of course. They still only have one woman, but there you go. We'll come to the Lib Dems in a minute. So, yeah, we've always looked at it in a very practical way. We've always had the results. And people like myself and existing members of Parliament now like Dawn and so on, and Kate Ostermore and Enfield, we are trying to nurture a kind of new generation. But you need to remember, when it comes to diversity, the Labour Party's always shown the way. You want to know why shouldn't I join the Lib Dems? You know, first of all, let me say this, and I always say it when I go to schools, actually. In the end, I'm not going to tell you which party to vote for. I just think it's really important you use your vote. And it's very important to say that to young people because they often are sceptical. Why shouldn't you join the Lib Dems?
Why should I stay with the Labour Party? That's easy.
Sorry?
Why should I stick with the Labour Party?
All right, but on the Lib Dems, and I'll come to the Labour Party. On the Lib Dems, the thing about the Lib Dems is that at a national level, they have some quite nice people, right? I mean, Shirley Williams, she started off Labour and then she became an SDP and then she was kind of Lib Dem. On a national level, they have quite nice people. But my experience of the Lib Dems at a local level is not so happy. It's not a coincidence that currently the Lib Dems don't have a single ethnic minority MP, and they only have one woman MP who came in the Richmond by-election. And for some of us, having been lectured by the Lib Dems for decades about their moral superiority, to see them in bed with the Conservative Party, to see Clegg and Cameron doing their all boys together press conferences, to see them vote. I mean, they claim, oh, you know, we held the Tories back. No, they didn't hold the Tories back. They voted for some of the worst thing the Tories did. There is nothing about the Lib Dems' record when they were in government alongside the Tories which would make me want to vote for them. But if you want to vote for them, is all good, right? But on the question of why the Labour Party, look, we have a leader which people want to slag off. We have a media and a kind of liberal intelligentsia which has never been more hostile to the Labour Party. Before I came here today, I was reading this week's New Statesman, which is just page after page of abuse of Jeremy Corbyn. But you know the thing about the Labour Party and why I don't believe the time is right for a new party or for all of that? The Labour Party has a history. Almost everything progressive about this country, the National Health Service, the huge expansion in public housing, the huge expansion in universities, the fact that somebody like me could go to Cambridge and become a Member of Parliament, we actually owe it to the Labour movement. And despite everything that is wrong with the Labour Party, and there's nothing anybody could say that I've not heard before, I believe, and you'll say, this is how naive Diane Abbott is, I believe that the Labour Party is what it has always been, the last and best hope of working people. And if it's getting things wrong, the answer is what I did 30 odd years ago was to get inside the Labour Party and work for change. You will never persuade me that there is anything to be achieved for the kind of people I was born amongst and the kind of people I care about. You will never persuade me there's anything to be gained for them by getting involved in UKIP, the Tories, and yes, the Lib Dems.
That would have been a brilliant final question to end on. But there was the bloke who asked you about the post-service industry. Let's do this one in 30 seconds, and then we can go for a drink.
I remember the day of the vote on the referendum. Okay, let's try in 30 seconds, right? And I was told it was raining actually some day, knocking on doors trying to get people to vote, to vote Remain. And actually in Hackney they did. In Hackney it felt fantastic. Hackney delivered a huge vote for the referendum. So late in the evening then, I was doing a bit of telly, I was doing CNN down in Westminster, came home, was going to go to bed, went to bed, because I was due on BBC Breakfast in the morning. And then I started to hear the results, and I've never forgotten what it felt like. Hour after hour, it became clear that we were losing. And at first I thought, oh, London will be enough. Huge pro-Remain vote, pro-European vote in London, that will be enough. But it became clear as the nights wore on that we were going to lose, and it was a terrible feeling. I worry that the Tories are going to use Brexit as an excuse to push a small state, low wages and conditions, inward-looking, xenophobic Britain. So yeah, there's a lot to worry about in post-Brexit Britain. I think that, there's always been this current in British politics, about immigrants and how they're the cause of everyone's problems, but that has reached, huge proportions now. I was online, I looked at the front page of the Daily Mail. The front page of the Daily Mail this morning, I forget what the actual story was, but it was a big picture of Nigel Farage drinking a pint. So the Daily Mail has become what? The UKIP Gazette? We have to push back against what's happening post-Brexit. And whether and however you do, you may not want to join a political party, but we have to push back against it, because the danger is that everything that we appreciate and value about being British, everything we appreciate and value about living in London, will be pushed back by the forces that have been unleashed by Brexit.
Thank you. If we could show our appreciation. Thank you.